right. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Jessica. I'm the curator of museum collections here at Brucemore, and I'm going to be giving your presentation tonight. This is a version of our Mansion Mixers program, which is something new we've been trying for the past few months. We've had a lot of success. It seems like people have been having fun. You guys are having fun, right? Yes. Okay, good. And so we are going to talk tiki, and we're going to learn a little bit about how Brucemore became the home of the earliest example of an in-home tropical or tiki bar in America, and how the phenomenon of tiki kind of came to sweep the nation. So, how did this 1886 Queen Anne Victorian mansion become home to the first example of an in-home tiki bar? Like many things in American history, we have the unintended consequences of Prohibition to thank for that. So in 1924, Howard Hall, an up-and-coming industrialist, married Margaret Douglas, the eldest daughter of Cedar Rapids' most prominent family, the Douglases, and owners of Brucemore. They first moved into the Garden House, which is a smaller white house that if you were outside playing the lawn games, you might have seen it outside. It's just to the west of the mansion. A few years before that, Prohibition had taken place. Prohibition. Boo.
Guidelines.
So it began being enforced in January 20th in 1920, but Iowa had also already been dry for about 4 years at that point. Prohibition, boo, yes. Prohibition started here in 1916, so a few years before Margaret and Howard were married. But because the Douglas and the Hall families were very prominent and wealthy, they could still purchase alcohol very easily if they had wanted to, and they could also expect that authorities would probably look the other way for any infractions. So Prohibition is what led to the rise of in-home and private bars, often known as speakeasies. Basements were often used as these spaces for these illicit bar rooms. And we begin to see people starting to kind of convert spaces that were previously unused in basements that would have just been used for storage and utility into spaces for entertaining. And with a large basement in the bottom of the Garden House at his disposal, Howard decided to open his own speakeasy in the Garden House basement, and he called it Hall's Hellhole. And this is the flyer, yes, my favorite, the gigantic den of iniquity and a veritable sinner's paradise. So that was his creation. We think it opened somewhere in about 1929. Here are some images from the walls of what remains of Hall's Hellhole in the basement of the Garden House. The first mention, like I said, it was in October of 1929 from Ellen, who is the middle Douglas daughter. The room was painted with some kind of jazz era designs. I think the woman pictured in the bottom right kind of looks a little bit like Josephine Baker, so bringing in some of that jazz influence. But it also has every speakeasy's necessity. It's got a door with an eye hole cut into it so you can peep to see who is coming through the entrance door. The space also included a pool table and probably the roulette table that is in the Grizzly Bar, probably was over there originally. And Howard would have been using this space to entertain his colleagues from Iowa Steel and Iron and from Iowa Manufacturing, and bringing in people that he wanted to kind of impress. The bar room was legendary among Howard's friends and associates, and sometimes he and Margaret would even let people go down there and party and entertain when they weren't even home. So from Margaret's diary, we can see a little bit about how she kind of saw the space and how it was used. So here she talks about Howard bringing 4 or 5 men home to see the bar, and Ken did broadcasting from the other room. And what she means by that is there was also a ham radio station in the basement, like you do. You know, you all have got those. And they had a grand time. And I think it's also kind of cool that she notes they were country boardmen from the courthouse. So this still would have been during Prohibition too. So very interesting. Even their prominence was not always enough to protect them though, because a diary entry from Ellen, the middle Douglas daughter again, in 1930 notes that the Garden House was raided and all of the liquor stolen. Dear, dearie me. In 1937, Margaret's mother, Irene, passes away, and she leaves Margaret and Howard the mansion and Brucemore. So they're going to move over to the mansion shortly after her passing. Howard's persona was only getting larger and grander by this point. At this point, he's already acquired the first of his 3 pet lions, all named Leo. So you can really see that he is definitely trying to promote himself and make a name for himself in the community. And with an even bigger basement in Brucemore, Howard first created the Grizzly Bar. So most of you have already been in there, where we got your drinks tonight. This Wild West themed bar was very on brand for Howard. He could incorporate a lot of the things that he already had for the hellhole, brought over the roulette table and the slot machines that he had down there, and then he could make that room even grander. So he did the Wild West theme in there with the birch bark lined walls. Western movies and books would have been very popular at this point, so it just all was very trendy and on brand for Howard. And with the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, the hellhole and the Grizzly Bar weren't really risky spaces to have in your house anymore. It was accepted that bars would be in houses again. But they were still always the highlight of being entertained by Howard and Margaret here at Brucemore. And Howard also wanted to make it even more memorable. And so that is where the tiki of it all starts to come in. We're going to talk about the birth of tiki first. So there's a few important things to kind of keep in mind. Tiki culture is really emerging in the 1930s, when the country is in the depth of the Great Depression. Most Americans couldn't travel at this point. Travel was very expensive. And people's lives were difficult and often very uncomfortable. So people were longing for ways to escape and to be able to travel to these beautiful destinations. Prohibition was a thing of the past. People are going out to new bars and new restaurants. They're kind of reopening, so there's new opportunities for people to start going out and socializing in bars again. And lastly, Hollywood and popular authors are churning out movies and books about the South Seas, leading to widespread interest in places like the Hawaiian Islands and the Caribbean. And so that's where the forefather of tiki culture comes in. So meet Ernest Raymond Gant, aka Don Beach, aka Don the Beachcomber. So the reality of Don's life is kind of muddied by the own mythology that he created around himself, much like Howard Hall in some ways. But he was originally from Texas. Most historians agree that he probably traveled throughout the kind of South Pacific during his young adulthood, maybe working as a bootlegger. And along the way, he was starting to collect kind of Polynesian and nautical bric-a-brac. And then in 1933, when he came back to the US, Prohibition had ended, and he opened his first bar in Hollywood called Don's Beachcomber. He decorated the space with all of the stuff he had collected, and he started creating food and drinks that were inspired by all of the drinks and the food that he had had on these travels, and it was just what people wanted. His cocktails were often rum-based, and the theatrical tropical decor created the escape that Americans needed at that point. And his popularity was immediately apparent, and it started a trend that inspired many competitors. One of his competitors was a man named Victor Jules Bergeron, aka Trader Vic, and he is the other kind of forefather of tiki. Vic was a native Californian, originally from the San Francisco area, and he opened his own restaurant in 1934 called Hinky Dinks. He travels around to the Caribbean islands. Again, he's inspired by the drinks and the food. And in 1937, he's even more inspired when he visits Don the Beachcomber. And so he kind of takes some of those same ideas from Don the Beachcomber, also incorporates Chinese food from visiting his own visits to Chinatown in San Francisco. Actually, the crab rangoon is an invention of tiki culture and not a Chinese food. So there's your fun fact of the day. And in 1946, his book gets published, his book of food and drink. Its author, Lucius Beebe, says, "Vic didn't invent a better mousetrap. Rather, he evolved into a delightful and welcoming man-trap." And that world beat its path to his swinging doors in no time flat. So he really started to bring tiki culture again to the masses. So they were so successful, both he and Don, that it was inspiring other bartenders to pop up and make up their own tiki drinks and their own tropical themed bars. And that is where this room comes in. Now I want you to look at this picture. Does this look familiar to maybe your surroundings now? Kind of a little bit. How about this one? Yeah, this room is pretty much a replica of this right over here. So this, all we know about this photograph is that it is from a San Francisco-based photographer. It's in our archives. And basically, this is probably the picture that Howard had from a visit that he went on, saw that room, took a picture, brought it back and said, I want this for myself. So this is the room, this unknown tropical bar, probably in San Francisco, is what's inspired Howard to do his own. So Howard hires his own local artisans in 1939 to create this room or recreate this room. At this time, Howard was traveling out there to California quite a bit, had the exposure to these places, but he and Margaret never actually traveled to Hawaii or really around the Caribbean very much. They did have yachts and they loved to sail, so they were probably very interested in kind of tropical and ocean-related things. And Howard's gift for self-promotion, again, really comes into play in this room. It is going to be the perfect place to entertain his guests. A couple of details that I always like to point out in this room is one, that Howard and Margaret like to show their home movies down here. Actually, on this side of the wall, you might be able to see a couple of hooks on the walls back here. Right above my head over there. You can kind of see them. That's where the projector hung down. So that's where he could show his home movies. And if you look at the photograph that's on the screen, you can see that there is a little projector wall cut into back where Stephen is standing right now. So yeah, hi Stephen. So that's where they were showing their home movies. But what kind of parties did this room really see? Unfortunately, we can only really imagine. Howard and Margaret didn't write about them very much. That might have been intentional. But one thing we know is that this was a space for both men and women. From the picture that we saw earlier, both men and women were entertained down here. And then we had things like part of Margaret's seashell collection. So this was kind of a reflection of both of them in some ways. And it certainly was an impressionable room. People definitely remembered it when they came to visit Howard here in Cedar Rapids, when they might not necessarily remember a lot of other things about coming to visit Cedar Rapids. But is it tiki? So I really want to kind of hone in on a little bit of the different types of tiki culture that you see and kind of the evolution of tiki. So tiki historian Sven Kirsten, yes, there are actual historians of tiki, wrote in his book, The Book of Tiki in 1990, that there are really 5 styles of tiki. So you've got tropical or pre-tiki, beachcomber style, trader style, Polynesian pop, and then high tiki. And our room, being from 1939, really falls it more into the earlier forms of tiki. So that's really going to be more of your beachcomber style, kind of more eclectically decorated. And you don't see any tiki idols or tiki heads in this room. Those came a little bit later. So that's more of the Polynesian pop and the high tiki that we're more familiar with from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The true golden age of tiki really takes off in the 1940s after the end of World War II. And James Michener's Tales of South Pacific and its subsequent musical adaptation, South Pacific, that really sets it off in people's minds. And that's what really turns people on to the idea of tiki. Walt Disney even opened his own enchanted tiki room in 1963, and the symbol of the tiki idol proliferated in kind of tropical design. And then Hawaii becomes a state in 1959. So being able to travel to these places becomes a reality for many middle-class Americans. But by the 1960s, tiki is really starting to decline. It's falling out of favor. People coming of age in the 1960s with more global awareness, tiki seemed kind of inauthentic and invented to them, and often it can be seen as racist in some of the depictions of native peoples and cultures. And the popularity of tiki bars and restaurants waned, and popular chains like Don the Beachcombers and Trader Vic's started closing up their locations. but it really wasn't truly gone for long. By the 1990s, amateur tiki enthusiasts across the country and bartenders were beginning to take an interest in tiki items as they're finding them at garage sales and estate sales, and they start researching and networking and really writing the history, and they become what's known as a subculture as Polynesiacs. Many of these people create their own tiki bars in their own homes, and then cocktail culture also goes hand in hand. There's a revival of cocktail culture. Jeff Beachbum Berry set out to re-engineer and recreate the drinks that were served at Trader Vic's and by Don Beach. And bartenders like Martin Kate opened their own revival tiki bar, Smuggler's Cove, which is widely regarded as the best tiki bar in the world now. And so there is still a really vibrant tiki culture that really gets its start dating back to the 1930s. So little did Margaret know when she donated her home to the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 1981 that she was playing a small role in preserving a cultural and culinary phenomenon. And we're proud to have a small part in that legacy, and we're glad that you were able to come and share a cocktail with us here in the Tahitian room, just like Howard and Margaret would have wanted. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions if you have any. And I'll turn on the rain in here in just a second.
You live in the house with,
Yeah.
is it still, like,
And so
see it, or what?
it's,
You tell that there was bar back.
yes, you can still tell. Like the paintings on the walls are still there. There's a lot of the design elements that are still there, but now it's just a big kind of empty room. There's none of the original like elements of the bar.
The style of the original bar was the tropical as well?
That one was more of the jazz age, 1920s. Somebody had her hand up, yeah.
So, how long? I mean, is Trader Vic's still there?
That's a good question.
I'm thinking Warren Zevon's Werewolf's Monday, right? That's like late 70s. I don't know.
Yeah, I believe I was just kind of preparing for this presentation, and I think there is a restaurant group that still owns the trademark for Trader Vic's, and so there might still be some Trader Vic's around, but I don't think it's the original location.
And where was the original?
It was in San Diego, San Francisco. Yeah. Okay, yes.
How many of the items in here are original or re?
Everything in here is original. So when Howard died in 1971, Margaret more or less just kind of shut the doors down here. She would bring people down occasionally to show them things, but for the most part, everything is original to Howard and Margaret's creation. Yeah.
Are there any other shocking things that people should make sure they see in the basement that?
If we want to open the bathroom door, I could open the bathroom door so you can be surprised by Howard's gag. Not a lion.
There's no lion in there.
No lion.
Is there a lion in there?
No.
Like
What?
the Hangover movie? Is there a lion in there?
No. It's another surprise. I'll open the door so you can be surprised.
Okay, we want to see it.
So how do you turn the water on?
Okay, so it's on a switch. So I just have to flip a switch and it'll come on here. It takes a second for it to get kind of warmed up. But if you want to get up and take pictures or kind of pose with it, feel free. That's the end of the presentation, so thank you guys so much. God, cheers.